Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And I'm anxious to resume our reading and discussion of the current book here at Inquisition Update, The Global Vatican, by former U.S. Ambassador to the so-called Holy See, Francis Rooney, United States Ambassador to the Church of Antichrist. And yesterday we concluded with a brief discussion about the Pope's intervention in Nicaragua and not being completely studied on the subject. I can't fill in too many blanks for you except for the fact that the papacy intervened in the internal affairs of a government, which we know is standard practice for the papacy as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, self-professed, self-styled. My guess is that what really took place in Nicaragua was not so much communism being a threat to the Roman Catholic Church, atheistic communism, because after all, this is just part of the dialectic that energizes the papacy and gives cause for change. My guess is what really belied the uprisings in Nicaragua was liberation theology, which seeks to liberate Roman Catholics from the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope. They wish to remain Catholic, but kind of have their own church. And the papacy intervened, and also you can bet the Catholics at the CIA, the Catholics in action, and intervened as well, and that it was a joint foreign policy effort by the United States and the Vatican. After all, that's what this book is entirely all about, and any mention of Nicaragua plainly is indicative of joint foreign policy measure and an effort by the United States together with the Vatican to control politics. Now, we're going to continue now where we left off yesterday on the program. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, the fourth full paragraph on page 144. It says, 3 months after Managua, Nicaragua, in June of 1983, the Pope showed his mettle again. He returned to Poland in a far less conciliatory mood than in 1979. Meeting General Jaruzelski, head of the military government, that is the communist military government, John Paul bluntly described his homeland as having, quote, become one great concentration camp, unquote, under martial law. The Pope complaining that Poland had been one great concentration camp. The fact of the matter is, the biblical, historical, and prophetic fact of the matter is, the papacy in the New World Order is going to make the whole world a great concentration camp under martial law, his martial law. The papacy's goal is to rule the whole world and to silence any opposition. That's pretty much a cosmic expansion of a concentration camp, isn't it? All right, he made it clear that he intended to meet with Lech Walesa, who was held under house arrest in a remote hunting lodge, but the Polish government balked. According to George Weigel, the Pope's own advisors, including Secretary of State Casaroli, counseled John Paul to drop the matter but the Pope was insistent. Quote, "If I can't see him," that is, Lech Walesa, "then I'm going back to Rome," unquote. Confronted with this ultimatum, wouldn't be an ultimatum to me. I'd say, well, the plane's waiting. But no, it says, confronted with this ultimatum, the Polish government gave in. The Pope met with Lech Walesa in a cabin in the Polish countryside. 1 month later, martial law was lifted in Poland. So now we have this case where the Pope liberated the people. Well, you would certainly trust someone who lifted martial law or intervened in a way that would cause martial law to be lifted. But that's ignorant of the fact of what the Pope's global intention is. He says no one would ever characterize John Paul II of the 1980s as a rash or irascible man, but he had a firm resolve and a great way of moving past the usual diplomatic parlance to say exactly what he meant, while motivating his diplomatic corps to follow. The world is a better place for it, says this author. The 1980s were dangerous years around the world, more dangerous than most people knew at the time. In the Able Archer affair in 1983, for example, the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Reagan administration, with the help of the Vatican and other allies, had the Soviets against the wall. But would they submit, or would they strike back? The world would need some luck, or maybe that same divine intervention that saved the president and the Pope from assassins' bullets earlier in the decade, for the communists to go away peacefully. In the meantime, Ronald Reagan was not one to sit by and watch events unfold. 3 years into his presidency, he made a decision to ensure that no matter how this all worked out, the United States and the Vatican would face it together. On January 10, 1984, the Reagan administration announced its intention to restore, quote-unquote, full diplomatic relations with the Vatican after a pause of 117 years. Restore was the operative word, since relations were never formally broken. Back in 1867, Congress merely voted to stop funding the mission. What occurred, and before I make my comment, I'll finish with the paragraph. It says the administration only needed Congress to retract that decision. It was discovered after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War in the late 60s, that John Surratt and the conspirators against Abraham Lincoln and his assassins were guided by the Jesuits. Now, that's a fact of history that's been hidden to prevent a domestic religious war between Protestants and Catholics. But that was the real issue in 1967. The Vatican was responsible for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln through Jesuit-controlled conspirators, John Surratt being the leader, and John Wilkes Booth being the assassin himself. And not only was Lincoln assassinated, but there was an attempt made on the entire cabinet. That, too, is left out of history. Most people who are just casually aware of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln are unaware that it was a total attempt to decapitate the government of the United States. Now, this became public information. And that's why the mission to the Vatican was suspended. And here, even only decades after losing to Jesuit assassins the life of Roman Catholic President John F. Kennedy, Ronald Wilson Reagan reestablishes formal diplomatic relations with the Vatican. You have to know that Ronald Reagan knew who assassinated Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. That's not a secret. And he knew about it. And it says the administration at that time in 1967 only needed Congress to retract the decision. Ronald Wilson Reagan had the decision of 1967 overturned, completely ignoring the fact that the papacy made an attempt to decapitate the government of the United States. So that not being a threat anymore, since the presidents of the United States are completely in bed with the scarlet harlot of Rome, it's okay to lift the ban. And especially after Vatican Council II, when the ultimatum was given by Rome to Protestants, now that you believe in a future Antichrist, you have to restore all that you stole from the papacy as a result of the Protestant Reformation. Since you no longer believe that the papacy is the Antichrist and you believe in a future Antichrist, a single individual, then the Protestant Reformation was a grievous assault against the legitimate throne of God Almighty on the earth, and that the papacy truly does have the divine right to as vicar or replacement of Christ on earth to rule over the kings of the earth. And that's what the United States, the Protestant nation of the world, now must do. Conquer the rest of the world for the papacy. Make him once again the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that's the intent of Ronald Reagan. Informal diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Were there a shred of Protestantism still left in this country, there would be no relations whatsoever with the man of sin and the son of perdition. But since Protestantism has been silenced by futurism, the belief in a single Antichrist, a single individual that doesn't even come on the world scene until just before Christ returns, some say 7 years, some say 3.5 years if you're a pre-trib or a mid-trib or a post-trib. But had it not been for futurism, there would not have been Vatican Council II. There would be no ecumenical union by the Protestants to the Roman Catholic Church, and they would not together today constitute a political mandate as they do. But they do constitute a political mandate. And that's why this country has been engaged in war ever since, to help restore all that the papacy lost as a result of the Protestant Reformation. It's a hideous reality, but it's not hard to wrap your brain around it once you get past all the lies. Now the book continues. He says, I've heard many explanations for why Reagan restored diplomatic relations with the Holy See. In one version, it is asserted that Margaret Thatcher influenced Reagan. Her own country, Great Britain, where we got our Protestantism, in one version, it is asserted that Margaret Thatcher influenced Reagan. Her own country, Great Britain, had recently elevated the status of its representative to the Holy See to that of ambassador, and Prime Minister Thatcher convinced Reagan that her country gained much by doing so. I wonder what Tyndale would say about this. I wonder what Latimer, Ridley, and Cranmer would say about establishing full diplomatic relations between Great Britain and the papacy. Someday we'll get to hear what they have to say. God hasten the day. He says it has also been written that William Wilson, Reagan's personal envoy to the Pope at the time, made the case to the president that the United States representative to the Holy See should acquire the status of a full ambassador. The simplest explanation is that Reagan understood, as had Robert Graham back in 1959, that formal relations between the United States and the Holy See were inevitable. Quote, a sensible and long overdue move, unquote, as the Washington Post put it. That Reagan awarded the Vatican embassy post to Wilson was no surprise. Wilson was an old friend of Reagan's from California, a businessman, a fellow horseman, and a converted Catholic. The real surprise, given all the history that had come before, was the public reaction to the White House's announcement, which was almost no reaction at all. No protest. No protest. Muted expressions of discontent came from some evangelical groups, and a few legal scholars took issue on constitutional grounds, such as separation of church and state and the non-establishment clause. But polls showed that a majority of Americans supported diplomatic relations with the Holy See. Now can you see the blindness that has overtaken the United States of America, the spiritual, biblical, prophetic, and historical blindness that has befallen this country, all because of futurism? One can't hardly comprehend the blindness of this country, much less attribute it to their most favorite prophetic doctrine, futurism. It says Congress approved Wilson's appointment with a landslide vote. Most Americans seem to agree that the status of the Holy See as a sovereign power, and thanks to the 1929 Lateran Treaty, a temporal power, duly qualified it as a legitimate diplomatic partner for the United States. What happened at the Lateran Treaty in 1929? The Pope was restored his temporal or kingly power. That's when the Pope then once again legally, not lawfully, but legally became the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Remember, the revolution in Italy overthrew the Pope's temporal power, took away from him his papal states. The Pope was no longer a king in the world, and neither was he the King of Kings. 1929, the Lateran Treaty restored kingly status, governing status, control over the civil law. It put a kingly crown back on the Pope's head, a head which had seemed to receive a mortal wound at the time of the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution, for that matter. But that was all done away with in 1929. The Pope became a sovereign temporal power, and that's what duly qualified it as a legitimate diplomatic partner for the United States. It's not a partner of the United States. It is the governor of the United States foreign policy. Quote, we respect the great moral and political influence which he and the Vatican exercise throughout the world, unquote, said the president's spokesman of Pope John Paul II, announcing diplomatic relations on January 10, 1984. Quote, we admire the courageous stand he takes in defense of Western values, unquote. At the same time that Wilson was nominated to be ambassador, Cardinal Pio Laghi, who had been serving as the papal envoy to the United States, was immediately elevated to the status of nuncio or ambassador in Washington. The process in the United States took a little longer, requiring confirmation of Congress. This was not long in coming. On March 7th, 1984, 205 years after John Adams predicted the United States would never have diplomatic relations with Rome, something occurred that was both remarkable and natural, says the author. The United States named its first full ambassador to the Holy See. And what do you get now? Fulfillment of Bible prophecy. The second beast that rose up out of the wilderness, where the gospel had never been preached, now causes the whole world to worship the first beast, the one that rose out of the sea. Multitudes, peoples, nations, and tongues. Europe. The unholy Roman Empire was literally reborn, thanks to the United States of America, a once Protestant land. Now we'll move to chapter 11 of the book. It's entitled, To the Vatican. Begins with a quote from Madeleine Albright, another British divine, a nation that was once Protestant, who was polluted by high church theology, higher criticism, destroying the King James Bible in the minds of people, perverting Bible prophecy in the colleges and universities, and literally making Protestant Great Britain Catholic. Madeleine Albright says, quote, "If diplomacy is the art of persuading others to act as we would wish, effective foreign policy requires that we comprehend why others act as they do." Now, the text begins, "The first hint that President George W. Bush might have a role for me in the second administration, or even more incredibly, that he was considering me as his ambassador to the Holy See, came on the evening before the president's second inaugural, in January of 2005. Kathleen and I were attending a dinner organized by the inaugural committee at the Washington Hilton Hotel. As dinner was breaking up, I spoke briefly with a high-ranking White House official seated nearby. Quote, "How about the Vatican?" he said. I don't recall my response, says the author, other than surprise. I certainly expected nothing. If I were on a list of candidates for the ambassadorship to the Holy See, I figured it would be a long and distinguished list. Putting the possibility out of my mind, I returned to enjoying the inaugural activities and celebrating the re-election of President George W. Bush. I was in Tulsa a few weeks later when the phone rang. Dinah Powell was calling from the White House, asking if I might be available to visit Washington soon. Dinah was head of presidential personnel, responsible for filling positions in the executive branch, so I knew something was up. I assumed that they might be considering me for a post in Latin America since I had done business there and speak Spanish. The previous September, the president had named me to join Secretary of State Colin Powell in delegation to represent him at the inauguration of the new president of the Republic of Panama, Martin Torrijos. A few days later, I went to the West Wing to meet Dinah. After chatting briefly about some common friends, Dinah came to the point. Quote, "President Bush wants you to go to the Vatican," unquote. Really? My jaw must have dropped. Are you sure about that? She looked surprised. What? Don't you want to go there? Do you want me to tell the president you don't want to do that? Unquote. Of course I will go, says the author. I had a lot to learn about the Vatican, but I already knew enough to understand that the Holy See, by virtue of what it does and how far it reaches, and given the alignment of its values with the president's, George W. Bush, would be a fascinating and satisfying place to work. I also knew that 2005 was likely to be a pivotal year for the Catholic Church. A pivotal year indeed. We'll be back with more from the Global Vatican. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support the program, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And again, we thank Nicholas for seeing the value and the shared beliefs and common goals of Inquisition Update, and has taken it on at his own expense. So please support First Amendment Radio. And if you wish to contact me directly, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now, I'm going to retreat to the beginning of this paragraph that I began just before the break. This is the author speaking, Francis Rooney. He said, I had a lot to learn about the Vatican. He'd just been asked to be the United States ambassador to the Vatican. He says, I had a lot to learn about the Vatican, but I already knew enough to understand that the Holy See, by virtue of what it does, which has been outlined in this book, and how far it reaches, which also has been outlined in this book, it reaches to the stars. It reaches to the throne of God by its own decree. He continues, and given the alignment of its values, that is, the values of the Holy See, with the president's, would be a fascinating and satisfying place to work. President George W. Bush had shared values with the papacy. I wonder how far those values went. Well, I've talked about it many times. I won't rehearse the whole thing again, but I know it verbatim. In one interview by Raymond Arroyo on the Eternal Word television program, the official Roman Catholic channel, President Bush was asked by Raymond Arroyo, Mr. Catholic, when you look into Pope Benedict's eyes, what do you see? George W. Bush's immediate and single response was, quote unquote, God. That's how closely aligned the values of the Pope and that of President George W. Bush were. The papacy sees itself as God on earth. That is stated officially in Roman Catholic canon law. And George W. Bush, in one word, acknowledged the deity of the papacy while professing to be a Protestant. That's the condition that existed. See, it was okay for a Protestant to acknowledge the Pope as God after Vatican Council II. And it was even okay for the President of the United States to acknowledge the papacy as God. Now that video presentation is still extant. You can watch it for yourself. It took place in 2008, just prior to Pope Benedict XVI's visit to this country in April of that year, 2008. It's in the EWTN archives. I watched it not once, but twice during the midnight retelevising of the current day's programming. It actually happened. Raymond Arroyo asked George W. Bush, when you look into Pope Benedict's eyes, what do you see? God. Now, that may not make much sense or even raise any concern unless you are a Protestant. Unless you have biblical, historical, and prophetic understanding, then it has a world of meaning. So he says, but I already knew enough to understand that the Holy See, by virtue of what it does and how far it reaches, and given the alignment of its values with the president's, would be a fascinating and satisfying place to work. I also knew that 2005 was likely to be a pivotal year for the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II was 84 years old and in poor health. At the very moment that I was meeting with Dinah Powell in Washington, he was in the hospital in Rome with influenza. His papacy was ebbing. A new pope would soon be installed in the Vatican, and when this occurred, it would present an important opportunity to institutionalize the United States mission to the Holy See, to go beyond the personal charisma of Pope John Paul II, which had been so important to the mission's founding, and to pursue values and goals shared by the Bush administration and the Roman Catholic Church. So the mission was going to include shared values and specific goals between the government of the United States and the papacy. This is an admission in the book. He says, perhaps most importantly, I understood, contrary to conventional wisdom, that organized religion was becoming more important, not less important, in international relations. Among those who had come to this same conclusion was Madeleine Albright, who had served as Secretary of State under President Clinton and later wrote a book, The Mighty and the Almighty, about her epiphany on the role of religion. An epiphany on the role of religion. I wonder if it had anything to do with the Bible. It's not mentioned here. It says, quote, the star most of us navigated by in those years was modernization, unquote. Albright reflected on her earlier views, quote, which many of us took as a synonym for secularization, unquote. Irreligion. And it says her generation of diplomats had seen religious rivalries as vanishing, quote, echoes of earlier, less enlightened times, unquote. Earlier and less enlightened times. I would say that the darkness is now more pronounced than ever in history. So what would Madeleine Albright be referring to? Protestantism, perhaps? That would be my guess. Less enlightened times. That's what Madeleine Albright thought about Protestantism. It says, but then came 9/11. Quote, since the terror attacks, I've come to realize that it may have been I who was stuck in an earlier time, unquote. What humans believe in their souls, Albright and many others came to realize, matters as much to world affairs as economics, political alliances, or weapons. So religion is all important to Madeleine Albright. I wonder what religion is all important to Madeleine Albright. He says, while I lacked Secretary Albright's experience in foreign policy and came from a different end of the political spectrum, her perspective certainly made sense in 2005, and it was reinforced and deepened by the reading materials given me by the State Department. There was no better place to confront the new religious reality than the Holy See. That's the new religious reality. the Holy See. About a month after meeting Dinah Powell, I returned to Washington and stopped by the State Department, where I was handed a stack of forms to begin the presidential appointment process. The forms contained detailed questions concerning financial assets, foreign travel, political contributions, and personal relations. The White House had its own questionnaire, as did the Senate. In the meantime, personnel from the Diplomatic Security Section of the State Department conducted a thorough background check, calling on neighbors and friends. Along with completing the paperwork, I drove into the intellectual preparation for serving at the mission to the Holy See. The process began with a large stack of books suggested by the State Department and church leaders, supplemented by conversations with ad hoc group of friends and advisors. In April of 2005, I had a series of consultations in the State Department with other ambassadors and officials who had expertise in the issues I would encounter at the Holy See mission. Additionally, Kathleen and I attended the ambassador's seminar held at the main State Department building on Virginia Avenue and at the George P. Shultz National Foreign Affairs Training Center in Arlington. This 2-week session was a valuable introduction to the internal State Department processes and procedures and gave us information on a broad range of issues pertinent to service as a U.S. ambassador. We were still attending the State Department course in early April when John Paul II passed away. The death of a pope is always an extraordinary event, but the death of this pope was especially moving. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims poured into the Borgo neighborhood around the Vatican City in the days after John Paul II's death to pay their respects and pray. Among these were tens of thousands of Poles who traveled across the continent to Italy to mourn the man who had freed their homeland. The city of Rome could barely accommodate the flood of pilgrims, whose numbers were soon swelled by an influx of foreign dignitaries arriving to attend the Pope's funeral. He literally deceived the whole world. It says the delegation from the United States was unprecedented. Led by President Bush and including former Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, the American presence in Rome spoke to the important place John Paul II held in the hearts of the American people. Let me tell you, John Paul II held a special place in the hearts of these presidents. But how arrogant is it to suggest by this author that the American people were as concerned about the death of John Paul II as these presidents? The presidency of the United States doesn't represent me, nor you. It represents the papacy, as this book well describes. He says, Kathleen and I watched the television coverage of the funeral mass from our hotel room in Washington, along with an estimated 2 billion people around the world, many of whose lives were touched and transformed by Karl Wojtyła. On April 19th, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger of Germany was elected by the College of Cardinals to become the 265th Pope of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Ratzinger was already well known in Catholic circles and beyond. He had served under Pope John Paul II as prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. You may well recall it as the Holy Inquisition. He says the overseer of church doctrine. That it does, but it is also the overseer of the heretics. And likely, if you're listening to this program, it's an overseer of you and me. Now, as the chief spokesman for Catholic dogma, he developed a reputation as a fierce conservative, God's Rottweiler, as the American press often called him. My own limited experience with the media had taught me to take such characterizations with a grain of salt, and I look forward to meeting Pope Benedict XVI and having a chance to draw my own conclusions. Undoubtedly, the papal transition would be a challenge on many fronts, but it would also be a chance to deepen and broaden the relationship between the United States and the Holy See. But first, we had to complete the process and get to Rome. Kathleen and I were back in Washington, this time with our children, for my confirmation hearings in September before the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. Presided over by Senator George Allen of Virginia, the hearing was fairly straightforward. My wife sat behind me in the gallery with our sons Larry and Michael and our daughter Kathleen. For the record, joked Senator Allen after I introduced my children, you don't have to send 3 kids to Notre Dame to get this job. Georgetown or any other of the Loyolas are okay too, unquote. A not so humorous suggestion that it would be best that his children would be graduates of Jesuit universities, as opposed to any other ordinary Catholic university. Do you suppose the Vatican has an opportunity awaiting some of Ambassador Rooney's children? We might take a look at the roster and find out what role in the world those children play. But nonetheless, he says, as Senator Allen humorously acknowledged, every ambassador since Wilson has been a Catholic. While being a Catholic is not necessarily a prerequisite for capable representation of the United States at the Holy See, it definitely enriches the personal experience, says the author. A great many official diplomatic events occur at Mass, usually in St. Peter's. Did you hear that? Let me read it again. A great many official diplomatic events occur at Mass, usually in St. Peter's. So it's not just it's not just a time and place for them to crucify Christ over again. It's political. Remember, the Vatican is first and foremost a political institution, and it uses that religion to cloak its true objectives in the world. The Pope wears 2 crowns, a religious crown and a political crown. He is both priest and king in the world. Does that remind you of anyone else? Christ Jesus. That's what makes the papacy the Antichrist. He assumes to be Christ on the earth and puts himself in Christ's rightful throne. He is a usurper. And the whole world believes he's a Christian. He says a great many official diplomatic events occur at Mass, usually in St. Peter's. Furthermore, a diplomat's success depends largely on rapport and understanding, including an appropriation of the traditions, or rather an appreciation of the traditions, culture, and core beliefs observed by his interlocutors. As described earlier, the broad principles and values of the Holy See projects in world affairs, or rather projects in world, let me read it correctly. As described earlier, the broad principles and values the Holy See projects in world affairs are derived and grounded in Catholic teaching, in scriptures, and the gospel. Indeed, it does. Bible prophecy. The gospels are full of hints about this man of sin soon to arise. And it says, of course, many non-Catholic and non-Christian ambassadors from other countries serve at the Vatican with distinction. Some of these wisely retain priests as advisors to their missions to guide them in dealing with the Holy See. Quote, "You must always remember that we are men of faith before we are anything else," unquote. Monsignor Peter Wells, the most highly placed American in the Vatican Secretary of State, once told me. It's an important point. At the end of the day, the Holy See is the home of a religion. To understand the Holy See, one must first understand the essential doctrines of Catholic teaching and faith. That's going to be a prerequisite for everyone eventually, and especially since Vatican Council II. One must first understand the essential doctrines of Catholic teaching and faith. That's going to be the objective for you, to make you understand the essential doctrines of Roman Catholic teaching and faith. And you'll find them diametrically opposed to the Bible to which you profess belief in. He says, "I was sworn in by Secretary Andrew Card, the White House Chief of Staff, at his office in the West Wing. Kathleen and our children could not attend, but Monsignor Garelli from the Holy See's Washington Nunciature, which is the embassy, and my assistant Michael Napolitano were there. Quote, "We have a surprise for you," said Secretary Card after swearing me in. He walked us to the Oval Office. President Bush was at his desk, and he stood to greet us with a warm grin. I told the president that I would represent him to the very... I told the president that I would represent him to the very best of my abilities. Quote, "I know you will," he said. "That's why I picked you," unquote. He's going to represent the president, who has shared values and goals with the papacy. Do you see under that context any representation at all of the American people? Because if he represented the American people at all, he might represent me and call the papacy to his face in my stead, "Thou Antichrist, your days are numbered. What you must do, do quickly." He says, "I first met President George W. Bush in the early 1990s when our construction company built the Texas Rangers ballpark for him. The job was a huge opportunity for the company, and we made sure to justify the confidence the future president and his team had placed in us. Now, as his ambassador designate to the Holy See, I had every intention of justifying his confidence again. No president since Ronald Reagan had so truly appreciated nor been so aligned with the values of the Holy See as President Bush. Accordingly, I knew." In other words, George W. Bush was an even greater papist than was Ronald Reagan. He says, "Accordingly, I knew that I would have an important advantage in my work, some degree of understanding of what the president would want to accomplish with the mission to the Holy See." A few days after the swearing in, a package arrived in my office in Tulsa. Inside were my official instructions from President Bush. The letter outlined the duties of an ambassador to the United States in the year 2005. Listen carefully. Quote, "Our commitment to freedom is America's tradition. The advance of freedom is also the surest way to undermine terror and tyranny and to promote peace and prosperity. Your task is to help in advancing this cause by, number one, listen carefully, waging a relentless global war to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends. Now, you've just been told repeatedly by this author the shared values and goals of the papacy. And when this author talks about George W. Bush and the papacy in the terms us and our, you know who he's talking about. This is the first objective of this ambassador: waging relentless global war to defeat those who seek to harm us and our friends. And that's what's going on today, at your expense. Your treasure, your blood, your guts, and your soul. And I think it's time the United States government came clean about it. And I think the Protestants ought to protest.